He marched on. He felt as if he were stumbling, but his boots hit the ground with each step as if they would crush the bedrock itself. The wind picked up. Dust ticked against his armour. It stung his flesh. It caked his nostrils, numbing his sense of smell. The cries of the cur cocooned him. He retreated into his pain. The shriek of the wind was the sound of meaninglessness. He began to run. He did not know whether he was retreating from the pyre of faith or charging towards the void of hope. There was a weight in his right hand. It dragged at him. He lifted the object. He held it before him as he ran. It was his Crozius Arcanum. The weapon was his staff of office. It was the symbol of his purpose. But his God had declared his purpose a lie. He held a symbol with no referent. His oculobe magnified the weak light of Kerr's moon shining through the cloud cover, and before his eyes the ornamentations of the metal appeared to writhe. They were seeking a new configuration, a new purpose. He ran, through dust and night, through nothing and towards nothing, holding a thing of metal and power, a weapon as dead and as hungry, as searching and as agonized as he was. He saw nothing except the Crozius. He shut out the world. The wind and the dust were the static of reality, idiot sensation and noise, symptoms of a universal disease. There was no time in the void through which he moved. He was suspended in a limbo of spiritual laceration. He would have run through the night, but a noise reached his consciousness. It drew him back to the world. He turned with a snarl in the direction of the sound. He froze when he recognized it. Voices raised in prayer. He was standing near the intersection of 8 highways. Dust blew in serpentine twists over the rockcrete. The roads met in a traffic circle around a low elevation of granite. 8 staircases rose up to a house of worship that seemed to grow out of the rock itself. Kurtha Sedd stared, at first unable to understand where the chapel had come from. It was no cathedral, but it was large enough, its cluster of spires and gold-rimmed vaulted doorways imposing in isolation. There were no other buildings in the vicinity. There was no settlement within kilometers of his position. Then he remembered that this was precisely the point. He was looking at a wayfarer's chapel. They dotted Kerr, having sprung up in locations far from the major centres, but on the principal routes between them. Here the people could stop in their travels, rest and meditate, and express their love for the God-Emperor, the God who rejected their love. Kurtha Sedd walked towards the chapel. There were numerous vehicles pulled off on the verges. Most were on the road from Monarchia, more refugees, fleeing the terror of the Ultramarines. They had not heard the news of the day. They still lived in a galaxy where the worship of the Emperor was the most natural and needful thing. He donned his helm. He looked at the world with the eyes of a hunter. This was what he was, after all. Wage war, as you were created to do. The Emperor's words, the Emperor's command. Do not worship, spread nothing but conquest. Kurtha Sedd pushed the doors open. He walked into a scene of untroubled faith. The pews were full. There were more than 1,000 people present. They were dirty from travelling. The aisles were clogged with bundles of hastily assembled possessions. Many of the worshippers were weeping, but their voices were strong in their pleas for help and their praise of the god. Their homes had been destroyed, but they had hope. They had their belief. It was adamantine. It would support them. The doors shut behind Kurtha Sedd with a dull clang. He stood in the chapel, the sole being deprived of succour. He was the chaplain of an apostate god. The people turned to look at him. A collective sigh of joy rose to the chapel vaults. Then came a babble of voices, and from it emerged variations of the same words. Angel. True angel. Grey angel. The nearest celebrants, still on their knees, reached out to touch his cloak. They cried out their thanks. Saved, they said again and again. Kurtha Sedd slowly turned his head back and forth. taking in every detail of the scene, every soul present, hearing the joy in their voices, seeing the faith in their eyes, hearing the lie, seeing the lie. The wounds of the rebuke stabbed deeper and deeper. The universe was devoid of anything except grief and rage and betrayal. He had devoted his life to the truth, and now the font of truth had denied itself. In this moment, when he needed to feel the strength of truth more than at any other time in his existence, he did not know if there was any truth at all beyond the lack of all meaning. Rage in his bones, hate in his limbs, his fist tightened on the haft of the Crozius, the symbol in search of meaning, the weapon in search of blood. "You believe the Emperor has heard your prayers," he said. His helm speakers amplified his voice. The growl bounced off the walls. It filled the space with the iron of his pain. "You are correct. He has heard them. And he has come in anger. There will be no prayer. Obey him, and turn from him." There was a confused silence. He could see the ripple of bafflement move over the crowd. Then the silence turned into shouts, and they were still confused, but there was also refusal. It emerged from the roar of questions and shouts, clear and strong and fanatical. What he had said was not true. What he had said was nonsensical. What he had said could not be accepted. The people were right. But the Emperor had said otherwise, and so what was right was wrong. Grief and betrayal and rage, growing and festering with the beats of his hearts, merging into a single passion, one with no name and no expression except violence. A haze descended over his sight. He saw black and red, and truth and lies, and there was no distinguishing between them. "You will not worship!" he roared. "Our God commands it," he thought. But the people shouted louder and louder, calling on the Emperor and his angels. Their praise grew more desperate. With panicked fidelity, the handful of worshippers clutching at his cloak held it now as if to hold him in their world. Their desperation overwhelmed the awe that would have held them back from daring to touch his being. "Silence!" he shouted, and his agony was such that it should have torn the chapel asunder. Why did the air not bleed? Why did the stars not bleed? And there was no silence, only an ever greater cacophony of prayer and plea and song. And the haze, darker, deeper, flashing with the nova intensity of despair. Kurtha Sedd tilted his head back. "This is your will," he said, in defiance and obedience to the god whose back had turned. "This is your command," he said in hate and love, faith and disbelief. He raised the Crozius. It was suddenly filled with a purpose he could not name. "Release me," he said. But though he looked down, he was not speaking to the people gathered at his feet. Nor did he give them time to obey. He swung the Crozius. With a single sweep of his arm, he smashed 4 heads to spray and flying bone. The bodies fell away from him. The hands let go of his cloak. Though the tugging had been weak, as he smashed the mortal burdens, he felt a monstrous liberation. He swung the Crozius again. Blood splashed over his helm. His eyes saw red through red. The crack of bone and the tearing of muscle was the smashing of fetters. The shouts became screams. They were not loud enough. He could barely hear them through the roaring of his voice, the roaring in his head, and the roaring of the universe. So he struck again and again, faster, striding through the aisles, pulling out his plasma pistol as the crowd surged for the exits, summoning more fear, more death, more shrieks, and still the screams were not loud enough. With his right hand he battered the worshippers to shapeless pulp. With his left he brought fire from the heart of a sun to each doorway. With each blow, with each pull of the trigger, something broke inside. A part of him was wailing in horror, but he drowned that part in blood. Every death was another drop into the abyss, and the plunge was exhilarating. There was no difference between self-loathing and freedom. He was destroying everything he had been, but everything he had stood for had already been taken from him. The fall accelerated. He killed faster and faster, and he roared without words, shouting nothing at nothing, voiding his soul. With fire and iron, he transformed the outer world into the mirror of his slaughtered faith. He destroyed order. He destroyed sense. He destroyed truth. Red of blood, red of flame, red of screams, red of ending. He waded through bodies. Then there were so many dead that he was climbing over the mounds of his butchery. He needed more screams. He needed more blood as he fulfilled the Emperor's decree to its most obscene limit. He could not kill fast enough. He fired the plasma pistol without pause, pushing it past its critical point. The weapon overheated. The venting of the cooling ducts could not keep up with the rate of fire. The gun preserved its integrity with an emergency release. A cloud of superheated gas burst from the barrel. It enveloped Kurtha Sedd. It flashed through the entire space of the chapel, an expanding bubble of wrath itself. The readouts of his auto-senses screamed red and were lost in the crimson sea of his frenzy. The outer layers of his armour flash-boiled. The flesh of the congregation vaporized. The heat reached through his armour, through the grill of his rebreather. His lungs took in the wrath, and they withered. He staggered, and his arms dropped to his side. The incinerating gas cloud dissipated, leaving scorched walls and wet bones contorted in the instant of excruciating death. The red haze faded. He smelled blood and burned bodies. His auto-senses still flashed damage alerts. He blinked them off. He stood in the centre of the chapel, surrounded by his works, listening to the sound of his breathing, to his pulse, and to the thickening silence.